Okay.
All right. So we're going to start with the group one, which is like the intended audience and who is included, who is not included. What do you think, Ifad?
Well, so this was a question right at the get-go of this project, because the project was going to be about, it's a project that is funded by South Asian American Digital Archive, SAADA, and they were looking for projects that capture, and work with histories and archiving projects that look at marginalized communities that would fall under, in some way, South Asian American. Um, and so and from there we started thinking about Bangladeshi queer migrants, and that has to do with our positionality as queer migrants ourselves. We wanted to talk about and archive histories of the movement of our communities that are getting erased and that don't get space, be that Bangladesh or US, and within these broader histories of South Asian history in the US, which ends up reinforcing, upper caste and often India-dominated heavy, conversations and histories. Um, and so, and then when we started thinking about, okay, we want to focus on Bangladeshi queer migrants, even this idea of, migrant, that itself is also a state category, right? And through that kind of categorization, state violence is also enacted, right? A certain form of epistemic injustice is constructed, right? Through who's the migrant and who's the documented migrant and who's the undocumented migrant, who gets to be the legal person and an illegal person, and so on. So we also saw migrant as a category that can be a tool of violence. And so we wanted to interpret that in this project in the most open-ended way that we could think of, that we are going to embrace all queers across the spectrum who have any related experiences of moving between geographies. That could include people who are not in the US anymore, who have moved back to Bangladesh, or who are in the US in in different kind of statuses. Like they could be asylum seekers, they could be undocumented, whatever that may be. So we interpreted that quite broadly to attempt to not replicate that kind of state violence through that category.
Yeah, and one of the other thing that I would like to add to you, Ifad, is like you already mentioned that, how we broadened the categories. And that was, I mean, because it's a specific organization and they're putting out like a specific call to a specific group of people. For example, when SAADA put out the call, they mentioned that this has to be related to people who are in the US or who identify as South Asian American. And that was really a challenge, particularly for the community who are early migrants, or particularly the communities who are not documented, or who are asylum seekers, or who are like, moving between geographies, as Ifad mentioned. So we rather, I think at the beginning, even before like when we started thinking about this project, we were thinking about like, our oral history and an archiving project anyway. And that was like, I think the one that we had had some limitations. Like we could do like only 10, like we had only budget for like 10 oral histories, but we, in our mind, like we wanted to do like a broader project. But however, in this one, because we had those categorization of like Asian American and migrant immigrants, we negotiated with SAADA to some extent when we got accepted for this project, that could we expand these categories, because this is how these categories, as if I just mentioned, that could also exclude people from certain process of like preservation or archive. And that is something that we have to do, I guess, as a community who we are, like where we live, is like this constant negotiation, right? There are resources and there are funding and there are institutions and organizations, but we have to like constantly, I think, come up with our own ideas and how we want to negotiate like some of those categorization and challenges that come with like funding and grants and proposals. So that was there. We had our limitations, like we couldn't do more than 10, but we also expanded the categorization up until a point that we also interviewed people who are now back in Bangladesh. They're not living here anymore. And SAADA was like very supportive in that process. So very thankful to them. An intended audience, like I think like, to be honest, our initial thinking, I mean, we thought about it, like who is the owner of it? Do we have an owner of this archive, right? Like we talked a lot about the ownership of this materials, the oral archive, the stories, the artifacts that we are collecting, the art we are generating. And more we thought about it, we only felt that we are like sort of like this loose custodian of this. Like we are only there to, you know, have it in a way, like collect it in a way that goes back to the community. So eventually the main primary audience was always the community. And they are the owner of their own stories. We are in no way, neither I or SAADA claim that this is our project. It's really a collection. It's really a collaboration, and it is open to like the community, and they have the full ownership of these stories. Also, the people who participated in the interview, like where I think they were aware that they could take it down anytime if they want. You know, if there is any risk, if there is any change in their situation, that they could take the audio or any other materials that they're sharing down. So it was a very transparent process when we were thinking about, like, you know, how to approach such a vulnerable and, you know, already like a community who has faced so much violence already.
I want to just add to that, because when we think about audience, you know, there is this idea that, you know, there are the producers or the creators of a product that then the audience consumes in some way. The audience is separated from the creators, right? And the creators assume things about the audience, target them in a certain way to appeal to them in a certain way through this product that gets produced. And I think for both of us, for Queer Archives of Bengal Delta, and the way we set up the process of this project with SAADA, the product is not at the center of it. So this exhibit is not the center of our work. The exhibit is not what it drove all of the work, that we need to produce this kind of thing at the end of the day. Archiving, the way we conceive of it, is that it is really about the relationships, not the oral history itself or even the artifacts or the exhibit, but it is really the relationships that we establish, the relationships that we get to remember, the relationships that we get to sustain and create between ourselves and our participants who are our community members, right? And the relationships between us and the stories that we tell, they tell, and this collection that we co-create. So right at the get-go, when participants joined the project, from developing the questionnaire, the questionnaire was developed together. It wasn't that we had developed the questionnaire and asked them questions. So the questionnaire was developed together. The audios, once they were recorded, went through cycles, like 3, 4, 5 cycles of editing. I would edit, Rasel would edit, it would then go to the community, the participant, and then they would listen and they would have more feedback, what needs to be taken off, what needs to be expanded, and then we would edit again. So it was a year-long process from doing the first audio recording. It would take about 6 months to finalize each audio through multiple rounds of editing. The same goes for the artifacts. We talked about, well, what kind of artifact would you like to, you know, share with the story, what goes, and so we talked through that. And one of the interesting results of taking that kind of process is that the final product, if you really get into the exhibit, you might even notice already, since you've seen so many of them, are actually kind of illegible in many ways. It's hard to understand some of these stories. Some of them, there are certain things that come across as very mundane, or what are they really saying? Or maybe there are many bleeps in the audio. But that is precisely because the focus was not on an audience who could consume this easily and conveniently, but more about these relationships and our collective decision to tell the stories exactly the way we want to tell, taking into account systems of surveillance, systems of violence across US and Bangladesh that are targeting these people, right, that are targeting folks. So it was an attempt to expand the notion of archiving to understand people who are most difficult to understand given the circumstances. And we kept that illegibility. We played with that. We went with that. We didn't want to make it fully transparent.
Yeah, I think like there are two other questions which is related to the exhibit. One is like from group 3 that asks, what do the birds signify and symbolize in the portraits of the artist? And another one is group 5 that asks the question, what do the relationships between the subjects of this exhibit and their families have to do with their ability to produce arts and exhibits? They, like everyone who participated, they had their different like context and situation and realities. So some of the participants in this archive, if you went through the whole exhibit, they were anonymous. So we in fact worked with the artist to create like digital portrait of those characters because they didn't want to share their names. One of the participants wanted to change their voices. This is a lot about also what we mentioned at the beginning, Paul Sepua's the video that, how do we archive the invisible, right? The people who did not want to share their voice or did not want to share their photo or create like, any kind of trajectory of like sharing a trajectory of information that is tracing them back, like that we can trace them back, where are they from? So we also, the editing process that Ifa just mentioned, like tediously removed like the name of the places and the name of the institution that they were part of, or a friend's name that they were just when they were sharing, because they were sharing memories. So they were just chatting with us, and both of us are like Ifad, like they know them, we are part of the community. So they have, like when they were having a conversation with us, they were not thinking about an interview. They were really having a conversation. They're sharing their memories. They're talking about like some of the things that has happened in the past. So in terms of like their protection, in terms of like how they decided to participate in an open and public exhibit, was absolutely depending on their situation. Some of them are located in the US seeking asylum, undocumented, or they're a student, or they are on some kind of migration visa, and they decided to share their images and then some of the names. Some people decided to share partially, like they removed few names who are still back in Bangladesh, and share some of the names which is outside of the jurisdiction of Bangladeshi criminal justice system, right? So that was really like a big challenge for all of us, and we wanted to be very, very thorough and careful about the whole process. And that's why I think editing was one of the longest process in the whole design of the project, where we spend the most time. That we really sometimes like one of the, it's interesting, Atif, or he mentioned that he did not want to hear the interview and trusted us fully to remove all the information that we deemed best. And that was a huge responsibility. We probably edited that over a month, that interview. And even before publishing it, like we found out something and we again like went through the whole interview. And remember, like all of these interviews are 3-4 hours, sometimes longer than that, and going through the whole of it, because it's difficult to point out what is where. So we went through it over and again, so that it's safe. People who are trusting us, like the community members who trust us, we keep the trust. So that was the process, and that's how, like, I think people participated how they wanted to participate. And the birds, I don't know, what do you think? What do it signify? If I like
I don't know. They're not birds. They're birds, but they have the wings of butterflies, right?
Yes.
And so there is some they it's what was Ankur's thought behind it? I'm trying to remember because we talked about it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he shared like what he shared. And so Ankur Sinha is the artist. So we worked with like two different artists and I was curating the exhibit. When he shared like his thoughts about like using bird as a metaphor of people who are trying to create a nest. So that was like one of the, I think, like thinking about, because homemaking, an idea of home like came over and again in all of the conversation that we had with 10 interviewees. So there are like 10 birds, so they sort of represent like the 10 interviews we had, and they, instead of wing, they have this butterfly, instead of like they're yeah, like they have this butterfly wing, and which is like really like light, right? Like with a body as heavy as a bird. So it's really like an reimagination of our body, and I think like how we still desire to fly even if we have a body that is so heavy and doesn't allow us to fly, and try to create a nest but also get entangled by the nest, because if you look at the image, some of the birds are like trapped by their own nest that they're trying to create. Yeah, Ifad, you were saying
Yeah,
something.
also, I mean, if I were to read the metaphors there, one the other thing that stood out to me and that kept coming up in the interviews too, the sort of um, the precarity of homemaking and the temporariness of homemaking. Everybody who spoke in the oral histories, even though they find a home, it is not finding a home in the conventional sense of stability. It is
Yeah.
always something that is very much on the edge, something that can move anytime, that is precarious, that is it's sort of there is almost a time condition to it. People kept talking about how their relationship to their apartment and their houses is tied to their paperwork, right, for migration, that my visa will run out and I have to go, so I can't buy any furniture. People talked about how they never had any stable, like a lot of furniture, for instance, or people who have more stable paperwork. I don't know what that is, but let's a longer term visa paperwork. They talked about how the feelings of encountering their neighborhood was often mm, overlaid with their sense of displacement from Bangladesh. So I think in one of the stories, the person, they are walking in the street in their own neighborhood, and they forget, they pass their own house and they keep walking because they forget where they are. And so these kinds of experiences of home being like the home or the nest is not the center. It's like it's something, it's there, but it doesn't necessarily anchor you. It sort of is very it's muddled up with temporariness and precarity, and it doesn't make you feel at home or that you belong. So this kind of very unstable, ambivalent relationship to nesting and home. And nest to me is such a, it evokes in me the sense of warmth, but also such temporality. The nest could be thrown out any day. It can be destroyed so quickly. It's not a, it breaks with the season, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And two other questions, which is related to the archive, I think directly, is like, how did some people's lives change for better or worse after coming to the US? Why did some people choose to leave? And some of the interviews have a disconnect to their homeland, which is, I think, going back to the idea of home. Is this disconnect more because of religious reasons or cultural reasons or both? And also Richa posted something, opening the meanings of nest and home.
When we talked with Ankur, when we were designing, thinking about, this was earlier last year, so that's why probably our memories are a little bit vaguer on this. Yes, we did talk about homemaking and birds and nest. We had conversations about this, but I think there's more to be said about it for sure. Do you want to move to those questions, Rasel, the ones that you had just stated?
Yeah, so disconnect to their homeland. And is this because of the religious or cultural? I think like disconnect to their homeland is also a very complicated notion, because I don't know like how many interviews were assigned for, right?
Mm-hmm.
We assigned for interviews. But if you listen to like all of these interviews, one thing you're going to I think um, get the essence of like all of them are saying is that they have a very complicated notion of comfort, like where they feel comfortable, what is comfortable. Is it like the cultural memory that they have, the food that they were having in Bangladesh, or is it the freedom that they get after coming here, walking on the street middle of the night? Or like, I think I talked about like the change in my air quality and how that affected my understanding of migration. Like what does migration do to me, disconnect me from my culture, but also give back like this amazing air quality that I get in this country, you know. So and that's not the only thing that I get. Like it comes with vulnerability, it comes with like lack of protection, it comes with like, loneliness, certain sense of loneliness. And that is really like I think the essence of all the interviews, what they're talking about, that this disconnect is not only with the homeland. I think there is a disconnect with home, the concept of home, the concept of comfort. They're disconnected here, they're disconnected there, and they feel like they're outsider everywhere. I think that is like an overall like sense. Like I don't think anyone spoke um, with a certainty, a certain sense of like, certainty that like I am better here. Like this is a heaven, and this is the best of best that could happen to my life. I can be now queer and, loud and proud and all of that. It wasn't that simple. Most people were missing their home, but also have a very like homeland home, but also have a very complicated relationship with the homeland home because of what you mentioned, the culture, the religion, and so on and so forth, but also have a very complicated relationship with the home where they're inhabiting right now in the US because of the culture and the religion. What do you
Um,
think?
the other thing to add to that is that it is culture, religion, those dimensions are there, but also along with that, I think in the stories of Atif, in Rasel, your story, in a couple of other stories, it becomes very clear that aspects of culture and religion blend with state and institutions and police. And for instance, when there is a piece where the police officer comes to the house of someone and has a long conversation with their mother, telling them that you should treat your child, here's a card, and why is he doing what he's doing. And so there's also the question of how state manifests in the everyday life through police, through courts, through lawyers, that produces that disconnect, is part of this conversation again, like the structural aspects of it, and not simply cultures of people and religion. On the other hand, we also get the other side, that conservative people, religious people, are often seen as the problem. But then we have stories where the person comes out to his conservative friend, and the friend just says, "Pass me the beef," like it's okay. And, right, in Bangladesh, right?
Yeah.
Um, so you have this kind of complicated picture, that person finds a lot of solace and solidarity with actually conservative people and religious people who are totally who shower him with love and acceptance. And so this idea, it doesn't, so the stories sort of don't allow us to create this homogenous narratives of religion and culture being the problems per se in that way.
And just to add to that, probably it wasn't. I mean, obviously, one of the interviews that we took down was a transgender person from Bangladesh who is transitioning right now, and she mentioned this thing which was really striking to me, and eventually she decided not to put it in the archive. Is that, or like not to talk about it? Is that when she was migrating, she was scared of her wigs, carrying her wigs with her, because she had this idea that USA is a transphobic country. and the migration officer would be probably way more transphobic. So she presented herself as like that aligns with her gender. And that was really striking for me. And then another time, because I'm very good friends with her, she also mentioned about not getting the proper care, like when she's transitioning here. And she's like, I wish I could transition in India, you know, where like people would be more caring to my body. I'm getting less care here, you know. So this idea of freedom, like that you get in this country where like you have institutional funding or like government funding to go through transition, but the people who are doing the transitioning are not like, they don't care about like brown and black bodies, or they don't care like brown and black bodies equally as much as a white body or a cisgender body as much as not a trans body, right? So there are all these complications, I think, there, which is tied to our understanding of comfort and home.
I think on the whole, in a lot of our, I think, conversation, what keeps coming up is, um, I want to get back to this question of how are we, how are we agitating against, some of the conventions of what is, considered an archive, and in an archive being a space of neutrality, objectivity, where we have history and truth. And I think one thing that we're doing here is that this archive is really, an archive of feelings in some way, to think of it in one way. And it's an archive of feelings, as many other queer archives are often, archives of feelings. And that these feelings, as we have been talking, as Rasel has been saying, feelings in relation to comfort, in relation to home, in relation to nesting, homeland, disconnectedness, all of these feelings, they index a certain power structure that's in place, that violates us, that, marginalizes us. And at the same time, these feelings can be our guides for, thinking about what struggle can look like, what the fights can look like. And so it's both. And I think, and so in that way, we're disrupting, agitating against traditional archives that are about, evidence and reason and truths and facts. And this is not to say that, again, I don't want to fall into the trap of saying that there are no facts and there are no truths, but I think what we're saying is that archives are not about capital T truths. What we mean, we need to ask, what stories get told and how specific kinds of evidence are constructed to tell and support certain kinds of larger stories, right? And archives don't necessarily automatically determine truth and falsehood. But it can give us a space to think through the complex motivations behind, what's accepted as history, or what we tell, the stories that we tell. And I think in these oral histories, we can get into those the complexity of people's motivations, the complexities of desires, the ambivalence of desires, right? And I think that's something I wanted to bring in. At the same time, the other piece to me, like, how are we agitating, is that archives, conventional archives, are about collecting past items. And for us, and this question came up during the making of it, we were asking ourselves, archives are about doing past collections. What are we doing? These histories that we're collecting, each of these oral history subjects, their stories are actually fairly recent, just maybe in the last 5 years or so. And so, but at the same time, these are stories that are getting erased. So in that way, we're kind of challenging this linear conception of time that we have with conventional archives, where you have the old past, which you preserve for the future. And we're saying, we're going to preserve the now. And the now tells us something about our past, because our past has been continuously being erased, through decades and decades. And we need to do this in the present, to understand our past. So we focus on our present struggles and make memories out of these negotiations, complicities, and contestations. Those are the two main things I wanted to overall add. Russell?
Yeah, and just to add to that, Ifad, is that like I think when working on this project, truly accepted that the proposition of archiving, like it's impossible to archive everything, that when we talk about what is included, what is not included, it's not possible to include everything. What we need to think about that what is there, like how are they there? How are we organizing them? How are we categorizing them? How are we creating all these separations and boundaries? And in our very small ways that, why we chose a medium of oral archiving that inherently remove the face and you can only hear the voice. And some people are like, well, I'm not even like comfortable with my voice. You change my voice there, change the pitch of my voice. So, and accepting all of that is a way to tell that it is impossible to create like, if archive becomes like a 1:1 replica of the whole world, then archive is no longer archive, it becomes like what, truth or reality? And that is not what we are trying to do. And that's what we accepted and I think embraced in our process, that it is not the capital truth telling. It is not, we don't have the responsibility of people like fact checking the memories that people are sharing with us. That is not our position. It is really, I think, sharing of information, knowledge, and feelings and emotions, and how we, like talk to each other as a community, speak to each other as a community, and trust each other as a community. And that was really beautiful. And it's ongoing. I think like it hasn't ended. It's an ongoing process. We are interacting with the archive like every day, and we are learning and feeling differently in every possible way. I know, Ifad, you're going to stop me, so I'm stopping myself.
No, that's all good. No, Rasel, I was going to joke a little bit. I was going to share a little joke that we tell each other, because none of us are professional archivists, just so everybody knows. and
What is
we,
professional archivist?
yeah, what is it anyway? But and Rasel and I struggle with our hoarding habits, because we like to hoard all the memories that we can hoard. and so we try to keep everything as much as we can. And so so this so the archiving work that we do in Queer Archives of Bengal Delta also, it's embracing the messiness of queer archiving and not being able to categorize and classify things, and learning to live through that kind of mess. And yeah, I mean, if all of you have watched that TV show, the person who does the spark joy thing, who is organizes your room and everything, you pick up objects, and if they don't spark joy, you discard them. So we make the joke that our queer archive will not spark joy. Anyway, so with that, I think we'll wrap this conversation up. It's